Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Runaway Train Sports Podcast. We are back once again following the first official weekend of the Big Ten football season, and boy, what a weekend it was. We have a lot to cover today as we had a full slate of Big Ten action, including our Purdue Boilermakers coming out on top over the Iowa Hawkeyes 24-20. We'll be taking a look at that win specifically to begin and going into a little bit of detail on what we liked, what we didn't like, some things to work on, as well as some major highlights that we saw. Then we will, take a brief look around the conference and see what became of the first weekend in the Big Ten. As I mentioned, a lot happened, and there are some potential highlights to cover elsewhere in the conference as well. But first off, we're going to start where we all love, where we all find our passion and joy, with our Purdue Boilermakers getting the win over the Iowa Hawkeyes by a score of 24-20. This was a very intriguing game as we neared kickoff. We had obviously already known about the COVID-19 diagnosis in the head coach, Jeff Brom, who would officially be missing the opener against Iowa. As well as him, we also received news that All-American Rondell Moore would be on the sideline as well, even though it has come out that he is expected to play next week when the Boilermakers make a trip to Champaign to take on the Illinois Fighting Illini next week. We will see what happens with that. Not only in the list, unfortunately, it does not stop there, as it also came out that we would be missing a handful of other assistant coaches, including special teams coach Marty Biagi. He would be out, with Jamarcus Shepard filling in on the special teams duties for the game. There was also presumed starting running back King Doru was out with a hamstring, and I think there was someone else. Mershawn Rice, I think, also was held out due to being a little bit banged up. Not that Purdue is not still a bevy of weapons in the receiving room. So it seemed as we got closer and closer to game time that more and more players and coaches would be missing, and it got a little more dicey, to say the least, when it came to predicting what was going to happen over the next 60 minutes. But nevertheless, you can only play with the players you have. So, you have to do what you got to do, and, Purdue was going to take the field no matter who was available or who wasn't. Iowa, I believe, was also missing a couple of key players for one reason or another. I think both one or a pair of starting projected starting linebackers did miss the game, and that may have played a big factor in what we saw on Saturday. But nevertheless, the game began, and I think it was pretty clear from the beginning that both teams were a little rusty as they traded 3-and-outs a few times. I think there were 3 straight 3-and-outs before Purdue got the first down of the game and driving down for the first score of the game. As I quickly pull up the drive charts here, yes, it went. Iowa went 3-and-outs. Purdue went 3-and-outs. Iowa once again goes 3-and-outs, and then Purdue goes on a 9-play, 66-yard touchdown drive, capped off by a pretty beautiful pass from the new named starter, Aiden O'Connell, which was, I think, a surprise to a lot of people. O'Connell getting the nod over Jack Plummer, who many thought had the starting job for himself, and the UCLA transfer Austin Burton. So Aiden O'Connell gets the nod, plays the entire game, has his ups and downs. We'll get over those later, and then gets the opportunity to go out and continue where he left off last year. So what did we see? What did we like? It's hard to say that we did not like David Bell, who continued to absolutely destroy the Iowa secondary. I think I saw a stat which was in his 2 matchups with the Hawkeyes, had like 26 receptions for 420 yards and 4 touchdowns or something like that is something absolutely ridiculous. Those numbers may be a bit off, but the fact that it is that ridiculous speaks for itself. It seems that Iowa may have missed him on the scouting sheet, and Purdue was able to take advantage of that. Or it could just be the fact that, David Bell is a very good wide receiver and was going to do what he was going to do regardless. But nonetheless, David Bell ends this matchup going for 13 receptions, 121 yards, and 3 touchdowns, all 3 touchdowns that the Boilermakers scored today. Iowa just couldn't seem to find an answer for the sophomore wide receiver who routinely found himself in between coverage, as well as a couple instances making some very pretty and very fantastic plays, wrestling away. I remember one specifically was wrestled away from an Iowa DB to turn it into a first down. I remember that was a pretty big play in the moment, because otherwise that is a interception going the other way. Also in the receiving group, it was nice to see Milton Wright come out and have a pretty good first game. He started off pretty fast, with Iowa paying a lot of attention to David Bell. Milton Wright finishes with 7 receptions for 85 yards. He ended up missing a good portion of the game after taking a shot in the second quarter, I believe, and ended up getting checked out, I think, for a little bit and kind of, regaining his composure a little bit. We also saw Payne Durham get involved a little bit with 4 receptions for 41 yards. Malik Carr tallies his first catch as a Boilermaker, catching 1 pass for 15 yards. I think it'll be interesting to see how he gets involved as the season progresses. I could see him carving out a role for himself, especially down towards the red zone. And keep an eye on that. And then a couple other guys, a few receptions for 10 or less yards. We'll leave it at that. But David Bell, obviously the highlight of the day, catching all 3 Purdue touchdowns in this one. All thrown by Aiden O'Connell, as we mentioned, who finished 31 for 50, 282 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. And this is where we'll move into the offensive things we would like to see cleaned up. Aiden O'Connell played well, but there is definitely a lot of room for improvement. I think he got tunnel vision a lot in this one, which kind of led to a couple of those interceptions. One could argue isn't his fault, but at the same time, he did throw a ball a little too fast and a little too behind Payne Durham, and ended up being tipped into the hands of an Iowa linebacker in the red zone, which definitely hurt early in the third quarter. The other interception came towards the end of the first half, in which Iowa DB just absolutely made a phenomenal play, cutting in front of Ahmad Anderson Jr., and ended up coming up with the pick. And then in which Iowa went down and converted into a field goal to break the 14-14 tie just before halftime. So I think those obviously are things that you can improve on. Obviously, a DB making a fantastic play is hard to avoid. But the pass that was intended for Durham, who ended up being tipped as it was thrown far too fast, far too behind to be catchable realistically, I think that one can be covered up. I think there was also a few times that he kind of got tunnel vision on David Bell, intending to throw it to him, it seemed, no matter what, even if he was in double or triple coverage, in which there were other options available, maybe potentially short. Speaking towards that, I think there were a handful of times where he tried to make a pass into the second level when he could have gone a little shorter, where there was a little more space for the receiver to make a play, specifically on running on bootlegs. On the play specifically where Milton Wright took a shot and ended up missing a portion of the game, I think he had Horvath out to the right towards the boundary, who had a little bit of space, and I believe also underneath Ahmad Anderson Jr. was in the vicinity as well, right along the line of scrimmage, that probably could have made a play as well. But instead he throws it to Wright, who kind of gets put out into no man's land and ends up taking a pretty solid shot from an Iowa defender. Those are the kinds of things that I think come from watching more tape and kind of, being able to have those moments to work off of. And I think he'll be able to clean those up, hopefully. moving forward. So what else did we like from the offense? We liked Xander Horvath stepping in big for the currently banged up King Doru. Xander ends up finishing with 129 yards on 21 carries. No touchdowns, but he definitely was the workhorse behind the line on this game. And he absolutely, I think, definitely proved some of his haters wrong. He definitely has some moments where he needs to recognize that he is a north-south runner. I think he was caught multiple times trying to stretch a play to the boundary that would have seemed to have gone better if he had worked his way upfield rather than across the field. But that also is that's another thing that kind of comes with more experience. I think I saw a stat which was he is Purdue's first back-to-back 100-yard runner since 2018, something like that. It's been a little while. I can't remember exact stat, but we have a guy go for back-to-back 100-yard games, especially after last year where Purdue really, really struggled to run the ball. This was nice to see, and it gives me hope that even when Doru comes back, that the running game will be able to keep it up, and Purdue can find some balance on the offensive end. So why did Horvath find so much success running the ball, and it is behind a night and day difference O-line for the Boilers? I think this O-line play was probably the best we've seen in a few years at this point, and it gives me a lot of hope going forward as well. They were routinely able to keep the pocket pretty clean. I think they finished, let me check, I think Iowa only finished with 2 sacks as a team on the entire game, which was phenomenal when it felt like in years past the Purdue quarterback was usually running for his life. And so the fact that they kept the pocket clean gave Aiden time to assess the field, and he was able to step up, take the time. He gave the receivers time to get downfield, which helps. And I think this O-line is going to be one of the better ones we've seen in the Jeff Brom era, and it'll be. I'm excited to see what comes as we move forward if they're able to continue to find the success that they have. But they definitely did a great job in pass protection as well as opening up a handful of holes for Xander Horvath to have some success that he did. And we'll pause briefly to mention, I didn't mention this when we were talking about him, but Xander Horvath's hurdle along the sideline was probably one of the more athletic things you can see a 6'3", 230-pound man do. And I think that was pretty fun to see him pull off. Let's see, what could be better in there? I think getting the running back involved in the passing game, I think could be something that Purdue looks at more in the future. I think in years past, they've leaned on the running back receiver role as a way to simulate a running game. And maybe they don't necessarily have to do that if they are able to find some success straight up on the ground. But I think working the running back into the passing game is another weapon that the Brom, whoever ends up on the sideline, it seems, could utilize. Maybe not necessarily more, but having it as an extra weapon definitely wouldn't hurt. Moving on to the defense, which was another big question mark coming into this game. Basically, no one was sure exactly what would happen with the change to Bob Diaco as defensive coordinator. And I think it surprised a lot of people to see that there was a good mix between lining up in a 3-4 and lining up in a 4-3. There were moments where both shone, and there were moments where you could see kind of the detriment that both come with. I think that one big thing they did do toward the end of the game, or maybe earlier on, I just didn't see it, is move George Karlaftis off of the edge sometimes into the interior of the defensive line, where he's able to go against some bigger, slower offensive linemen, and we saw them, have some success moving him towards the inside. I think that's going to be something to keep an eye on as we move forward into the next few games this season and the rest of the season along the way. But the defense, I think, came out strong to begin with. They were flying all over the field. Obviously, they were able to force a handful of turnovers, which we love to see. When was the last time, we really saw a Purdue defense force a lot of turnovers? It was nice to see that, especially it was forced turnovers. Maybe not the first Iowa fumble, which I think was caused by their offensive linemen, but this was a game where we saw multiple guys, going to make a play to force a fumble. And we saw it multiple times. Jalen Graham being in position in the first fumble. And I believe it was Mackey who punched out the first ball, or maybe it was Cam Allen, but in the that last fumble, which led to Purdue's game-winning drive. But there were a lot of guys who were trying to make plays, and I think that was great to see. It was also interesting to see how the secondary seems to be one of the more aggressive physical secondaries that we've seen at Purdue in a while, and I think it's definitely going to play a factor going forward. They were able to find a lot of success in the pass game, and I think that coupled with the defensive front able to get pressure, George Karlaftis able to get pressure, and we'll get to him in a second, but I want to give a lot of props to DeMarcus Mitchell, the JUCO transfer, who is playing his first year here. Was absolutely also flying all over the field, making a lot of plays on defense. And let's just jump into him. He finished, with 6 total tackles and 1 tackle for loss. That man, I think, is going to be a good complement on this defense, because I think he's able to get downfield, downhill very quickly and get into the backfield. And we saw, especially on the last Iowa drive, where Purdue was able to overload one of those guys like Derek Barnes or DeMarcus Mitchell on the edge, same side as George Karlaftis, who is a mandatory double team whenever he's lined up across from you. That next guy is able to use his speed and athleticism to get around the edge and get a lot of pressure on opposing quarterbacks. So I think that's going to be some of the interesting things to keep an eye out going forward. I think another thing that really stood out was the depth that was displayed here today. I believe that the past especially last year, having a lot of freshmen work in with all of the injuries last season, gives Purdue the opportunity to rotate guys in and out and keep guys fresh. And I think we saw that at the end of the game, especially with guys not necessarily being as tired as we would expect them to be in years past. I think that also, and I'll transition this again, kind of the balance that we saw in this game. It wasn't the most exciting offensively, it wasn't the most exciting defensively, but the balance that was afforded to the Purdue defense by the offense, I think, also played a key factor in how they were able to keep up their energy at the end of the game. I think in years past, when you've had offenses that struggled, and I think the offense definitely struggled at times in this game, but they were able to give. In years past, it would be the offense would struggle, and so the defense would come off and then almost immediately have to go back on, which obviously is going to wear you down a lot quicker than finding the balance like we saw in this game, where Purdue was able to have some sustained drives and then, had a couple of bad turnovers and some drives stall out late. But having those drives that last, more than, 3 and outs, gives the defense a chance to rest and get some of that energy back. So we saw an opportunity for Purdue's defense getting stops, getting off the field early. That preserves a lot of energy. The Purdue offense able to make these longer, sustained drives. Even if they don't necessarily end up in points, they do afford the defense a lot more time to stay and get rested up. I think one of the things we saw towards that last Purdue drive, the game-winning touchdown drive, is the Iowa defensive front definitely start to wear down towards the end, because we saw Xander Horvath have some success on the ground, and the coaching staff said, all right, well, they're getting tired. Let's lean on them a little bit and, kind of drug out that offensive series, as much as they could, both as a time tactic, obviously, to work time off the clock, but also, they work down the defense until it gets to the point where on that touchdown play, that 3rd and 5, David Bell gets chipped by a linebacker. That defense is tired. They make one mistake, one DB covers the wrong man, and, David Bell standing with no one within 10 yards of him, catching a game-winning touchdown. I think a lot of those things, that balance that we saw, is fantastic. And I think a part of that also, and we'll move into it now, is special teams, where we had a lot of success. And I think we finally saw some of the consistency that was lacking last year, where especially in the punting department. I remember last year there were multiple times where you really weren't sure what was going to happen when a guy trotted out there to punt. And I think today we finally saw that consistency that we've kind of been accustomed to over the last few years. J.D. Dillinger only kicks 1 field goal, but he goes 1 for 1 from 29 yards, and then obviously goes 3 for 3 on extra points. And then you have Brooks Cormier, the punter, who finally, as I mentioned, got some consistency under his belt and absolutely had one absolutely brilliant punt where the Iowa return man lets the ball bounce. I think it bounced at the 3. and settled down at the 2-yard line. And it was probably one of the more beautiful punts we've seen in a very long time. So he ended up, punts 6 times, racks up 285 yards of punts, averages 47.5, which is fantastic, and ends up with a long of 58, which is also very good. This is the kind of level of special teams, at least in the kicking department, that we've kind of become accustomed to at Purdue. And I think it's going to be, if we can have Cormier able to knock down some of these great punts that we saw on Saturday, that, that's going to be a weapon in the field position game. And I think that plays part, and to wrap it back into the defense, having those guys be able to have their ears pinned back at their, 2-yard line on that one. I believe on that particular drive, they ended up stalling out pretty early in the possession. I think they may have gotten a first down out of it, but they didn't do much else past that. So that really gives the defense a lot of energy to go out and get off the field. And I really enjoyed seeing that. To touch on Iowa briefly before we kind of move on and take a look at the Big Ten as a whole, we heard a lot about Spencer Petras, apparently the second coming of Jesus over there, and the second coming of Nate Stanley, as they like to that I saw beforehand. Ended up coming out a little slow, a little rusty. You could tell that he was making his first start in the Big Ten, as well as making his first start on the road. He finished the game 22 of 39 for 265, no touchdowns, but he did end up running for one. He started out a little shaky, overthrowing guys, throwing behind guys, throwing the ball a million miles an hour. Kind of struggled with his deep ball accuracy, but he kind of settled in as the game went on and eventually put in a good game. I think at the end of the day, he's going to be a pretty good quarterback for Iowa. Once he gets a little more experience under his belt, playing in the Big Ten, as much as you expect to know what was going on, until you finally step on that field against another team, you're not really sure what's going to happen. So I think he is going to be a problem potentially later. His arm strength obviously is extremely well touted, and I think we saw it a lot. But Purdue able obviously to get the better of him, and I think Bob Diaco is the man to thank for that, because he was able to mix up defensive looks and able to get pressure on him most of the game, and was able to speed him up and kind of get him out of rhythm, which was really good. They were on the ground. They had a dual-headed monster here with Tyler Goodson and Mekhi Sargent. Both ended up right between that 70 and 80-yard mark. Goodson finished with 77 and Sargent finished with 71. Sargent put in one touchdown for them. They are on the other offensive touchdown on the day. But it was interesting to see Iowa's game plan when it came to running the ball. I think in the second quarter, they really kind of found their groove against this Purdue defense and found a lot of success running the ball, but then kind of abandoned it towards the end of the game. And it was really interesting to see, because they really were, they were racking up, between 4 to 6 yards a run. And it really didn't look like the Purdue defense was, going to be able to do much to stop them. And I think that's kind of when a lot of fans got a little nervous, because they've seen this script before, seeing teams be able to run all over them. And, that doesn't always bode well. But they finished with a $195 on the ground, as a team. A couple of touchdowns. There are only 2 offensive touchdowns on the day. And I think they found a lot of success on the ground, but kind of abandoned it towards the end. And you got to wonder how much being down by 4 with 2 minutes left played a factor into that. But they kind of moved away from it, and it definitely surprised a lot of people. Receiving, a relatively touted Iowa receiving core had a pretty quiet day. A handful of guys did have some pretty good days. Sam Laporta, 5 for 71. Nico Reganey, 4 for 61. Tyler Goodson went 5 for 59. It was a pretty balanced day on the receiving end, but I think at the end of the day, Iowa just ran out of offensive firepower towards the end and just wasn't able to make up for the turnovers, which we'll move into now, where Iowa finished with 3 fumbles, losing 2 of them. They were able to recover 1. As I mentioned, the first of them was knocked out by their own offensive lineman, but the other 2 were forced by Purdue players, which is very exciting. We like that. We like seeing that, definitely. Looking at them on defense, they had an okay day, finished with 2 sacks, and then 5 tackles for loss. Definitely a very good day. all things considered. But it just weren't able to get the job done when it mattered the most. And, we'll take that definitely. Let's see, anything else of note in this one? Let's see. Their kicker goes 2 for 2, long of 33. Nothing too crazy there. Iowa has a very decent punter who also punted 6 times for 265, average of 44.2 with a long of 52. I think in the beginning of the game, I think the first 3 punts of this game were all beautiful, and it got a lot of Big Ten purists very excited to see before Purdue had to go and ruin it by Aiden O'Connell throwing a beautiful pass over 4 people, landing only where David Bell could catch it. So, okay, we've now covered, I think, everything that we really need to touch on in terms of Purdue's game against Iowa. We're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we will take a look around the Big Ten and see some key takeaways on what we saw on the first weekend of Big Ten football 2020. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. We will now take a look around the Big Ten and kind of give some big things that we saw, as well as some things to look out for as we move forward. I think first we'll cover all the games that weren't quite so competitive, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some exciting finishes that we saw around the league. Obviously, the season got kicked off on Friday with Wisconsin taking on Illinois in Madison, in which Illinois fans were very excited to have another shot at Wisconsin, and I'm sure Wisconsin was definitely looking forward to enacting a little bit of revenge on the Illini for what they did to them last year. As we got into the game, it became pretty apparent that Wisconsin was definitely the much better team on their way towards a 45-7 win on Friday nights to move to 1-0. Illinois, on the other hand, had a pretty rough night, to say the least, and definitely will be burning the tape on this one and moving forward as they do. Wisconsin found themselves apparently a quarterback, and I think I can't remember if he's a redshirt freshman or a redshirt sophomore, in Graham Mertz, who actually, as of this recording, has had one positive test for COVID-19, which could have some pretty big Big Ten West implications if his PCR test does come back positive as well. I think this week is actually going to go on a brief tangent. I think this week is going to be very big on the future outlook of this season for the Big Ten. Obviously, guys aren't allowed to play if they test positive, and so it will be interesting to see what the results of this week come out with. If they see a giant spike in cases across every program, this could potentially put the Big Ten in a tough spot as they continue to move forward and potentially trying to play the season. So it'll be something to keep an eye on for sure going forward. But Mertz has a career day, I think, matching the Wisconsin record for most completed passes in a row. I think he finished 20 for 21. That was a 20 for 21, 248 and 5 touchdowns. I think, and his only incompletion was actually a drop. So that is always a little rough when you have a guy almost go perfect on the day of throwing, one completion for 250 and 5 touchdowns. Definitely is a pretty good day for a brand new quarterback. So it'll be interesting to see if his COVID results test, his second test could play a big factor in the Big Ten West, as that would basically involve him missing the next 3 games, which would include the Purdue game in that. But yeah, Wisconsin runs all over Illinois. I think Illinois' only touchdown actually was a defensive touchdown, so even then their offense wasn't able to do much against this Wisconsin defense. Illinois will look to bounce back against Purdue when Purdue makes the trip to Champaign next week. And I believe Wisconsin gets Northwestern, I think. I can't remember off the top of my head, so don't crucify me for that. Let's actually check here real quick. Try and check. Oh, no, they actually go to Nebraska. So, I was close. One in team for another. So let's see. What else did we have? We had the travesty that was Maryland Northwestern. Northwestern ends up beating Maryland 43-3. And a pretty, actually, I would say, surprising result considering how offensively challenged Northwestern was last year. They obviously get the incoming IU transfer in Peyton Ramsey, who ends up having a pretty solid debut for the Wildcats. And they had I keep looking at the score, and it is rough, to say the least, Maryland fans. So we won't spend too much time on this one. 43-3. Not sure what you say about that. Northwestern just was all over the field. Northwestern next gets to travel to Iowa, and which will be, I think, a fun test to see if this Northwestern team is for real or if Maryland is just really that bad. Maryland, on the other hand, gets a home date with Minnesota, which just suffered its first loss of the season against Michigan, in which we will get to in a moment. I'm trying to work my way down in terms of sadness for teams. Next, we'll move on to the Nebraska-Ohio State game. The beginning of this game was actually fairly surprising, as Nebraska actually scored first on the opening possession, taking it 75 yards in 4 plays, I believe, capped off primarily with I think it was a 60-something yard run by the younger McCaffrey, Luke McCaffrey. And they actually, what was it? I think they went up 7-0, and then Ohio State scored the next 14, and Nebraska actually tied it up 14-all early in the second quarter before Ohio State scored the next bunch of points, and that was all she wrote. Nebraska definitely came out strong and kind of faded towards the end, as it looked like Ohio State worked out all of the kinks that it had to begin the game. So Ohio State wins 52-17. Ohio State definitely looks like Ohio State. Justin Fields go for 276 and 2 touchdowns and 1 on the ground as well. They have a Garrett Wilson receiver go for $129 and 1 and 7 receptions. Definitely a good result there. They ended up with it's hard to see if it was a fumble touchdown or if it ends up going in as an interception return for a pick 6. But I think it was Adrian Martinez got hit pretty hard. It's hard to tell if the ball came out or if he threw it, but it didn't matter because I think it was a linebacker or defensive end caught the ball in the air and took it back the distance. So they get a defensive score as well. Next up, Ohio State makes a trip to Happy Valley, which is coming off of a rough one, which we'll get to in a minute, against Indiana. But they will be in prime time as the Buckeyes look to best the Nittany Lions next week. And then Nebraska gets another tough one when Wisconsin comes to town, like we just mentioned. I think that one could be a fun one to watch, especially if this Mertz COVID results come back negative, or comes back poorly for the Badgers. Moving on to the next game, and I'll go here because this was a personal favorite of mine to see, which was the Rutgers Scarlet Knights snapping a 21-game losing streak in the Big Ten when they traveled to East Lansing and absolutely dismantled the Michigan State Spartans to the tune of 7 turnovers when they win their first game since 2017, when they win 38-27 over Michigan State in Mel Tucker's debut as the Spartans head coach. This is one where Michigan State is definitely going to be beating themselves up about the turnovers. I think I saw that they end up outgaining Rutgers by over 100 yards or something ridiculous like that. But they still lose by 11. Definitely probably do, if I had to guess. When you cough the ball up 7 times, you're not going to have a good time. But good for Rutgers and Shiano's first game as a Big Ten head coach. Snaps that winning streak. Or losing streak, I should say, and gets the win 38-27. Up next, Michigan State gets a visit to Ann Arbor to take on Michigan, and Rutgers gets a fun home game versus Indiana, in which I would just absolutely love to see them come out on top in that one. Let's see, where do we move next? Let's talk Michigan, Minnesota. This was the primetime game of the evening, as 2 ranked teams battle it out in Minneapolis. Minnesota obviously coming off of one of their best seasons in a long time, and Michigan looking to break in a new quarterback and try to once again prove that they can win the East, even though they haven't gotten that close since Jim Harbaugh got to Ann Arbor. What transpired was a rough night for Minnesota, which ended up losing to the Michigan Wolverines 49-24. Minnesota got off to a pretty fast start and a pretty wild opening sequence. I think it was I can't remember exactly how it was, but it was like Michigan turned it over. I can't remember if they turned it over or just punted, and I think it was the next play. Or no, it was they went like 3 and out. Minnesota blocked the punt, and then they scored on like the next play or the play after that or something. It was a pretty wild beginning to the game. But Michigan just kind of leans on Minnesota a little too much, and Minnesota loses this one. I can't tell if this is one of those games where the score is closer than it looked or is worse than it actually was. But Minnesota definitely had a rough night, and thankfully they get from what it looks like, a pretty easy one next when they travel to Maryland to take on the Terps next week as they look to get into the winning column for the first time. Michigan, on the other hand, obviously gets a home visit from Michigan State, like we just said, as they'll look to probably embarrass Michigan State a little more in the next week, immediately after they get hosed by Rutgers at home in their opening game. So Michigan definitely will be looked at to win that one pretty handily, I would say. So where do we go next? I believe that brings us to probably the most exciting and most influential game that we had. And as much as it pains me to say it, it was IU taking down Penn State at home for their first win over a top 10 team since 1987. It is a stat that boggles the mind, especially when you look at how close they actually have been in the past few years, but they finally get over the hump and they get the win over Penn State and actually jump into the top 25 in the next week, probably rightfully so. But this was an absolute kind of shocker of a game, if I had to say so myself, as I'm going to pull up the, let's get a little more details on this, because this was definitely the most interesting game of the week besides Purdue, Iowa, obviously. Indiana ends up winning 36-35 in overtime, in which we will cover what exactly happened in overtime here in a minute. Let's look at this game a little more in depth, and then we will wrap this thing up as we look forward towards Illinois next week. So this was a very interesting game to follow. I was kind of keeping tabs on it while watching the Purdue game at the same time. But it looked like it was one of those games where if I look at it here and find the... where'd it go? Where is it? Why can't I... Oh, there it is. So Penn State jumps out to a quick 7-0 lead, but then IU scores 17 straight to actually be up pretty good at the half, 17-7. Penn State ends up scoring in the third to move it to 17-14, in which IU actually led, I believe, most of the a lot of the fourth quarter, if I'm remembering correctly. Let me take a look and see where we're at. And there's a lot to take away from this game. There were a lot of things happening. There were a lot of things just that boggle the mind, I think, a little bit. That to the point of, wow. Penn State had a 15-play, 54-yard drive that traveled 7 minutes and 39 seconds and ended in a missed field goal. I'm trying to see exactly what the third quarter looked like, and I opened this drive chart, and it just scrolled my screen. It looked like the third quarter was a lot of punts, a lot of, there was I started IU punt, Penn State missed field goal, IU interception, and then Penn State goes on 8-play, 57-yard touchdown drive to bring it basically all the way through the end of the third quarter. So relatively quiet third quarter before the final sequence here, which IU actually ends up being up 20-14 with just over 13 minutes left, and actually is feeling pretty good because the next few drives go Penn State punt, IU punt, Penn State punt turnover on downs with Penn State turns over on downs with 4:55, so just under 5 minutes to go, and IU's got to be feeling pretty good about that. But then they go 3 and out pretty much immediately, take about a minute off the clock. Then Penn State goes 3 plays, 74 yards, with capped off by a 60-yard touchdown, which IU just kind of blew their back end coverage, and all of a sudden Penn State finds themselves up 1 with, what was it? It was they find themselves up 1 with 2.5 minutes to play. Then IU goes 4 and out, turnover on downs, as they tried to make something happen. Ends up turning it over on downs on 4th and 21 with 1:47 left. And it looks like Penn State's actually going to pull this thing out. And here's the all-important moment of the game. On the next play, instead of kneeling the ball and starting to run the clock, waste IU's timeouts, I don't know how many they had at the time. I can't remember off the top of my head. They hand the ball off to Devin Ford, who runs 14 yards into the end zone for a touchdown, in which it was pretty obvious that IU was letting him walk in, as most of the defense kind of let him, walk into the end zone, in which you can actually see a lot of frustration on Penn State's side and a lot of joy on the IU side that he did walk in, because now they score and IU's going to get the ball back and have a chance to tie the game, depending on what James Franklin chooses to do here. And the fact that he doesn't fall, so I think it was obviously 14 yards. So as soon as he hit the first down line, he should have just fallen over. That would have been it. Game over. Penn State wins by 1. Not the flashiest of score lines, but you walk out of there with a win. Instead, actually, I'm not quite certain why they weren't just kneeling the ball to begin with. I mean, you needed to get a first down there, but at the same time, if you just kneel the ball down, you probably kick a field goal, granted, and then you go up by 4, so that takes away an IU field goal to win. But at least then they only have maybe 30 seconds left if they play their cards exactly right. So you don't kneel the ball out there. You get the first down on the ground, but instead your running back runs into the end zone. You then kick the extra point to only go up by 8. And then IU goes on a 7-play, 75-yard in 1:20 to score a touchdown and then gets the 2-point conversion, which ties the game up at 28 and now it's bedlam. It's just absolutely bedlam, because now you're tied, potentially looking at overtime. And it is crazy, because this is another part that confused me a lot about this game, was that IU kicked an onside kick, which then gave Penn State the ball on Indiana's 49-yard line. Then Penn State, gets a quick run for 9 yards to the 40. They call a timeout. They give one more shot. Pass falls incomplete. And then they try a 57-yard field goal basically at the buzzer and misses. So then it goes to overtime. Penn State scores in 4 plays, kick the extra point. And now here is where I will give my one and only respects to IU, is that Tom Allen, with the cojones the size of coconuts, scores the touchdown on a pretty nice pass and catch by Whop Phillier in the back corner of the end zone, decides to go for it, go for 2, go for the win. And I agree with this. I think this is something that Purdue should have been doing all along in previous games, to just end the game right then and there. They go for 2. It is Michael Penix rolls left and then makes a dive at the pylon, in which it is called good on the field. And then it goes to replay, in which it looks a lot like he doesn't cross the goal line before, and it looks like he's touched down early. But the fact that they call it good on the field is the key factor here, because there is no angle that shows definitively, did the ball cross the line first, did it break the plane, or did it touchdown out of bounds first? And because of that, the fact that it was called good on the field ultimately ends up playing the factor. The call stands. IU wins 36-35. Now, as I mentioned, that is absolute insanity, and I think this is going to be a game that haunts James Franklin for a while, because all you got to do is kneel the ball, man. All you got to do is kneel the ball, and you probably win. If your running back is smart, if you do decide to hand the ball off to try and waste a little more time, try and get a first down, your running back has to know to fall over there. He walks into the end zone, all of a sudden you're only up 8. And here's another thing. I'm going off on this game. Here's another thing. Why not go for 2 at the end to try and go up 9? And then the game is over. And then the game is absolutely over. Instead, you end up kicking the extra point. IU ends up going down, scoring, 2-point conversion, overtime. They go for the 2-point conversion again when you choose to kick the extra point again, and you lose. That is a game that Penn State lost. it is a game IU lost originally, and then Penn State said, no, you take it. I don't want to win. And IU said, all right, I guess so. So that is a wild and crazy game. Definitely one of the more wild Indiana games against top 10 teams that we've seen in a long time. And obviously the first that we saw them actually come out on top in a very long time. I just looked at the stats for this game. Penn State finished with 488 total yards. IU ended with 211 total yards on the game. They ended with 170 through the air and 41 on the ground. Penn State should not have lost this game, but Penn State lost this game and IU won this game. It was a crazy, crazy game, and I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with both of these programs going forward, as Penn State obviously gets to host Ohio State in what could be a very big game for them. I wonder if there was any looking ahead on the Penn State sideline, and they kind of got caught by the IU trap. IU gets a visit from Rutgers, as we mentioned, and what should actually be a kind of or they go to Rutgers, I should say, sorry, is actually a very interesting matchup that I think could play a lot of intrigue going forward. And I think the fact that it's in Piscataway is going to play a fun factor as well. So I'll be on the lookout next weekend as well. But I think that is going to wrap up episode 12 of the Runaway Train Sports Podcast. Keep an eye out later this week for our Illinois preview, and potentially look out for another podcast episode talking about the Illinois game in a verbal sense. So keep an eye out for that. But for now, I thank you for listening. And this has been a good weekend for the state of Indiana. Good weekend for Purdue football. Let's hope it can continue forward towards Illinois. But as always, Boiler up, hammer down, hail Purdue.